All right, folks, it's time for another episode of Supreme Readings. This time we won't read directly from the SEP, but one of the digressions that I mentioned last time. Last night, I stayed up all night to watch Trump speak in the Knesset in Israel, in the Knesset, and he's the fourth president to ever do so. And main thing I'm going to say is that I'm really hoping that this peace holds. It's interesting seeing Trump work as a negotiator who wants to give something to every party that they want, so they have an incentive to keep the peace, which is a bit different than just the moral proposition that you should keep the peace. And I will note that the pacifism article that we read doesn't touch on anything resembling what Trump's strategy actually was, which is more like political realism, like the realism of John Mearsheimer, who nevertheless is starting to seem a bit anti-Israel for some reason. Like he's just sort of getting a bit talking pointy. He's usually very detailed and analytical, but I hear him becoming tribal, Professor Mearsheimer. Anyway, so we went from pacifism to anarchism because anarchism came up constantly in the pacifism article, except they censored the word. You'll note that I had to constantly tell you every time they expressed anarchism in the pacifism article. I was like, by the way, that's anarchism. In the actual anarchism article, we did section 1 and section 2.1 and 2.2, and while reading those, I mentioned multiple times this other article that I constantly recommend about anarcha-feminism called To Destroy Domination in All Its Forms. So, without further ado, but we'll engage in greater digression, and instead of moving on to 2.3 of anarchism, we're going to take a trip through anarcha-feminism, since, how many times does it even appear in the article, on the main article? Feminism once. That's pathetic. So, it's sexist not to stay on topic here. You have to actually look at a real anarcha-feminist author. We could go straight to Emma Goldman, but Julia Tanenbaum does the history of anarcha-feminism and the process of realization by which feminists realized they were anarchists. Just like there's a process by which Christians realize that they are anarchists, and maybe there's a much longer process by which authoritarians realize that they've become anarchists. Not that they always were, because it's kind of the opposite, but maybe deep down people realize that power is a bit sketchy and requires justification. So let's share the screen. To Destroy Domination in All Its Forms by Julia Tanenbaum. Check our zoom. Oh, that could do to be zoomed a lot better. And line width. Okay. I think we can do this in one sitting. I'm actually sitting on a chair this time instead of cross-legged on the floor like my usual monkish way. Julia Tanenbaum, To Destroy Domination in All Its Forms. Anarcha-Feminist Theory, Organization, and Action, 1970 to 1978. Becoming Anarcha-Feminists. Oh, that's section 2. We need the introduction first. Introduction. Untitled Introduction. As anarchists look for genealogies of principles and praxis in a variety of social movements, from the anarcho-pacifists, ding ding ding, who spoke out against World War II, to anarchists who joined the Black Power movement, so too should they look for their feminist foremothers, not only in the early 20th century anarchist movement, but in the radical women's movement of the 1970s. I wish my mother was a part. She was one of those radical women. Many radical feminists shared anarchist goals such as ending domination, hierarchy, capitalism, gender roles, and interpersonal violence, and utilized and influenced the key anarchist organizational structure of the small, leaderless affinity group. They grappled with the questions of how to balance autonomy and egalitarianism and create non-hierarchical organizations that also promoted personal growth and leadership. In 1974, Lynn Farrell wrote, quote, "Feminism practices what anarchism preaches," unquote. Very good quote. Anarcha-feminism was at first created and defined by women who saw radical feminism itself as anarchistic. Even though I said earlier Emma Goldman was basically the first anarcha-feminist, I don't believe she used that term. They're about to mention her here. In 1970, during the rapid growth of small leaderless communities raising small leaderless consciousness raising groups, CR, around the country, and a corresponding theory of radical feminism that opposed domination, some feminists, usually after discovering anarchism through the writings of Emma Goldman, observed the quote-unquote intuitive anarchism of the women's liberation movement. Radical feminism emphasized the personal as political, what we would now call prefigurative politics, and a dedication to ending hierarchy and domination, both in theory and practice. CR groups functioned as the central organizational form of the radical feminist movement and, by extension, the early anarcho-feminist movement. Members shared their feelings and experiences and realized that their problems were political. The theories of patriarchy they developed explain what women initially saw as personal failures. And I'll pause right here to mention a framing that I think is very important of how I try to connect anarchism as a special kind of skepticism to skepticism more broadly. You know, Descartes had us doubting everything, which you can try, but the same finitude that prevents us from knowing everything also prevents us from doubting everything at a point in time. And for that reason, we seem to be forced to sequence our doubts, and then we can question the power relation of one sequence having priority over another. Why do people doubt themselves before the government when they could doubt the government before themselves? And this is what they're saying right here. Consciousness raising was not therapy, as liberal feminists and politicos frequently claimed. Its purpose was social transformation, not self-transformation. Certainly not buying new clothes and makeup. Radical feminist and anarchist theory and practice share remarkable similarities. In a 1972 article critiquing Rita Mae Brown's calls for a lesbian party, not the kind of party you're thinking of, anarchist working class lesbian feminist Sue Katz described how her anarchism came, quote, directly out of, unquote, her feminism, and meant decentralization, teaching women to take care of one another, and smashing power relations, all of which were feminist values. I had a similar experience. My mother definitely taught me feminism, but didn't teach me the word anarchism particularly. And also, my anarchism came out of really my epistemology, and we'll discuss at some point epistemic arguments for anarchism, why, power differences ultimately harm truth, knowledge and truth. Radical feminism attributed domination to the nuclear family structure. Thank you. Which they claimed treats children and women as property and teaches them to obey authority in all aspects of life, and to patriarchal hierarchical thought patterns that encourage relationships of dominance and submission. To radical feminists and anarcho-feminists, the alternative to domination was sisterhood, which would replace hierarchy and the nuclear family with relationships based on autonomy and equality. A chant that appeared in a 1970 issue of a feminist newspaper read, quote, "We learn the joys of equality, of relationships without dominance. Among sisters, we destroy domination in all its forms." These relationships, structured around sisterhood, trust, and friendship, were of particular importance to the radical feminist vision of abolishing hierarchy. As radical feminist theologian Mary Daly wrote in 1973, quote, "The development of sisterhood is a unique threat, for it is directed against the basic social and psychic model of hierarchy and domination. Radical feminists opposed the male domineering attitude, quote unquote, and, quote, male hierarchical thought patterns, unquote, and attempted to act as equals in relationships deeper than male friendships." To feminists familiar with anarchism, the connections between both radical feminist and anarchist theory and practice were obvious. Anarchist feminism was essentially a step in self-conscious theoretical development, and anarcho-feminists believed that an explicit anarchist analysis and knowledge of the history of anarchists who face similar structural and theoretical obstacles would help women overcome the coercion of elites and create groups structured to be accountable to their members, but not hierarchical. They built an independent women's movement and a feminist critique of anarchism along with an anarchist critique of feminism. Something I'm making quite frequently. To anarcho-feminists, And there's an anarchist critique to be made in the entire left right now, of course, because the left has gotten very authoritarian, not compared to how authoritarian the liberals got, which is as authoritarian as the PCs were, and how authoritarian the conservatives got, which is way off into la-la land. All the parties pretty much got more authoritarian during COVID, even the NDP. And none of them are anti-authoritarian enough. They built an independent women's movement and a feminist critique of anarchism along with an anarchist critique of feminism. To anarcho-feminists, the women's movement represented a new potential for anarchist revolution, for a movement to confront forms of domination and hierarchy, personal and political. Unlike Goldman, Voltaire de Cleyre, the members of Mures Libres and countless other female anarchists concerned with the status of women in the 19th and early 20th century, they became feminists before they became anarchists. So that's the key historical distinction here. Anarcho-feminists eventually merged into the anti-nuclear movement by the end of 1978, but not before contributing to crucial movement debates among both anarchists and feminists, building egalitarian, leaderless, and empowering alternative institutions, and altering U.S. anarchism in theory and practice. Becoming anarcho-feminists. The term anarchist feminist, quote unquote, later used interchangeably with anarcho-feminism, anarcha-feminism, first appeared in an August 1970 issue of the Berkeley-based movement newspaper, It Ain't Me, Babe. Probably referring to the Bob Dylan song. Often I say not to be confused with, but here it is to be confused with the Bob Dylan song, which is a great song, by the way. The newspaper published an editorial calling for, quote, feminist anarchist revolution, unquote, next to an article about Emma Goldman, who did get deported for supposedly inspiring the assassination of President McKinley, so watch out for that. The collective did not synthesize a theory of anarcho-feminism, but rather explained how their anarchist beliefs related to the organizational structure of the paper, which they designed as an affinity group to encourage autonomy and discourage, quote, power relationships or leader-follower patterns, unquote. They don't like the sheeple. It Ain't Me, Babe exemplified the, quote, intuitive anarchism, unquote, of the early women's liberation movement. Its masthead read, quote unquote, end all hierarchies. And the paper contained articles like Ellen Leo's, quote unquote, power trips, which exemplified the radical feminist tendency to oppose all forms of domination. And this is where my mother, I think, got some of these memes. She would go on at length about how the world was run and controlled by power trippers. First, she would analyze people's actions in personal relationships, and then say, well, the people in the government are people just like these. They have the same issue with power trips. So did she, but doesn't mean she was wrong in her statement. Leo wrote in 1970, quote, the oppression of women is not an isolated phenomenon. It is but one of the many forms of domination in this society. It is a basic belief that one person or group of people has the right to subjugate, rule, and boss others, unquote. Like anarchists, these feminists connected the oppression of women to a larger phenomenon of domination. Beginning in 1968 and growing in strength until 1972, radical feminism was anything but monolithic, and many participants differed greatly in regards to their views on sexuality, the family, the state, organizational structure, and the inclusion of transgender women in the movement. Well, not much has changed on that one. There's a bit of dispute there, isn't there? Most anarcho-feminists were initially radicalized by the political and cultural milieu of the anti-war movement, but it was their experiences in the women's liberation movement combined with the influence of Emma Goldman that led them to develop anarcho-feminism as a strategy. As feminists struggle to reclaim women's history, Goldman became a feminist icon due to her advocacy of birth control, free love, and personal freedom. Never mind that she was against women getting the vote, but if you read her article, it's pretty interesting to see what on earth Emma Goldman, of all people, said against women voting. Maybe we'll discuss that sometime, but go read it. In 1971, radical feminist novelist and historian Alex Cates Schulman wrote, quote, Emma Goldman's name has re-emerged from obscurity to become a veritable password of radical feminism. Her works rose from the limbo of being out of print to being available in paperback. Her face began appearing on t-shirts, her name on posters, her words on banners. Goldman criticized the bourgeois feminist movement and its goal of suffrage, which led many women to criticize her as, quote, a man's woman, unquote. That's about the voting thing. However, Schulman and many others argued that Goldman was a radical feminist worthy of recognition because she stressed the oppression of women as women by the institutions of the patriarchal family and Puritan morality, as well as religion and the state. So much for separation, solving that. As anarcha-feminist Kathy Levine wrote in 1974, quote, the style, the audacity of Emma Goldman has been touted by women who do not regard themselves as anarchists because Emma Goldman was so right on. It is no accident either that the anarchist Red Terror named Emma was also an advocate and practitioner of free love. She was an affront to more capitalist shackles than any of her Marxist contemporaries. Feminists honored Goldman's ideas and legacy by opening an Emma Goldman Clinic for Women in Iowa in 1973, publishing new volumes of her work, naming their theater troupes after her, and writing screenplays, operas, and stage plays about her life. In 1970, the women's liberation periodical Off Our Backs dedicated an issue to Goldman with her image on the cover. Despite this, Betsy Oleda and Bobby Goldstone's article about Goldman's life discussed what they perceived as her faults, her opposition to suffrage, and disconnect from much of the women's movement because she had become a, quote, super heroine, unquote, in the movement. So go read Emma Goldman. Siren and early anarcha-feminist networks. Goldman encouraged women to make connections between radical feminism and anarchism, and her writings often served as radical feminists' introduction to anarchism or the impetus for them to make connections between anarchism and feminism. To many anarcha-feminists, this theory represented both a critique of the sexism of the male New Left, including its anarchist members, as well as a critique of socialist and liberal feminism. Despite this intuitive anarchism, attempts by early anarcha-feminists to develop an anarchist analysis within many radical feminist collectives felt silenced, while women in the anarchist movement, where misogyny ruled as much as in the rest of the New Left, also felt alienated. Anarcho-feminist attempts to elucidate connections between feminism and anarchism, like those of Arlene Myers and Evan Paxton, were often met with intimidation and censorship in mixed groups. These conditions created the possibility for an independent anarcha-feminist movement, but first, anarcha-feminists would have to communicate and develop their theories. Early anarcha-feminist theory and debate emerged through Siren newsletter. The first issue, produced as a journal in 1971, contained, quote, Who We Are, the Anarcho-Feminist Manifesto, unquote, written by Arlene Wilson, a member of the Chicago Anarcho-Feminist Collective. The manifesto focused on differentiating anarcha-feminism from socialist feminism through a critique of the state. Quote, the intelligence of womankind has at last been brought to bear on such oppressive male interventions as the church and the legal family. It must now be brought to reevaluate the ultimate stronghold of male domination, the state. In February of 1970, Arlene Myers and the Siren Collective switched from journal to newsletter format, which allowed feminists throughout the U.S. to participate in defining anarcha-feminism and its theory. Siren allowed women in diverse, often not explicitly anarchist, collectives in many regions of the country to communicate and develop their theory. Later issues of the newsletter included news items related to feminist and anarchist activism, including political prisoner support for anarchists in Spain through the Anarchist Black Cross, women's health clinics, child care and living collectives, and working at info shops like Mother Earth Bookstore, which is a reference to Goldman's publication, Mother Earth. The last three issues of Siren, published in 1973, contain the majority of the newsletter's analysis and debate, covering topics such as state power and authoritarianism, prefigurative politics, lesbian feminism, and gender identity expression. Issue 10 of Siren contained two statements by transgender individuals critiquing both sexism and the gender binary and offering a progressive vision of transgender inclusion within the movement. Eden W., a member of the Tucson Anarcho-feminists described her experiences as a, quote, male woman, unquote, and critiqued, quote, the authoritarianism that demands that males must be of one gender and females of another, unquote, thus critiquing the gender binary itself as a form of authoritarianism. Finally, she asked feminists to look on, quote, femophiles, unquote, as their sisters. This essay stood in contrast with the prejudice towards trans women in the larger radical feminist movement, which sometimes portrayed them as interlopers who brought male privilege into women-only spaces. That same year, radical feminist Robin Morgan famously denounced male-to-female transgender feminist songwriter and activist Beth Elliott as a rapist and quote-unquote infiltrator at the 1973 West Coast Lesbian Conference, although it is worth noting that 2/3 of the conference goers voted for Elliott to stay. Sounds like Beth Elliott should have filed a lawsuit. Some feminists conflated transgender women with men in drag, accusing them of being rapists, and felt that they retained male privilege and should not be allowed in feminist spaces. Although anarcho-feminists were undoubtedly influenced by this discourse, attitudes towards transgender people were not monolithic in the feminist movement at large. Eden W.'s statement emphasizes that she is heterosexual, perhaps because of this widespread fear of transgender women as rapist infiltrators. This limited discussion of transsexuality nevertheless reveals that anarcho-feminists were willing to discuss this conflict and give transgender people a voice in the movement. Most of them. Issue 8 of Siren also contained, quote, Blood of the Flower, unquote, a statement written by Marian Leighton and Kathy Levine, members of the Cambridge-based Black Rose Anarcho-Feminist Collective. Unlike Wilson, Leighton and Levine reject not only socialist feminism's analysis of the state, but its tactics and the idea of movement building altogether. To them, quote-unquote movements, as represented by the male left and its ideas of a vanguard, separated politics from personal dreams of liberation until women abandoned their dreams or dropped out of the movement altogether. Instead, they advocated leaderless affinity groups in which each member could act as an individual and presented this anarchist form of organization as the alternative to hierarchical movements, politics practiced by socialist feminists and liberal feminists. The small leaderless affinity group allows members to participate, quote, on an equal level of power, unquote, without leadership determining the direction of the movement. Although it does raise questions if it's essentially small, what happens when you try to scale it up? Many people have said that this method of organization is great at a small level, and that as you get larger, it gets harder and harder to do without hierarchy. It is something I've observed. They wrote, quote, organizing women in the new left and Marxist left is viewed as amassing troops for the revolution, but we affirm that each woman joining in struggle is the revolution. This anarcho-feminist vision, almost similar to the cell-like structure of earlier insurrectionary anarchist groups, emphasized valuing individual contributions in small groups instead of building the large, often authoritarian and impersonal, quote-unquote, revolutionary armies that many new leftists and social feminists envisioned. To achieve this, anarcho-feminists would build their movement through small affinity groups and participating in various feminist and anarchist counter-institutions. Small groups, growing networks. Anarcho-feminists also form study groups, which, like the CR groups, consciousness-raising groups, also acted as affinity groups and formed and dissolved quickly. Many groups were located in university towns, partially due to the success of anarcho-feminist network Notes as a communications network, which allowed activists to communicate and organize outside of major urban areas. Collectives are often small, flexible, and project-based. Because they required intimacy and small size, when groups became too large, as the Des Moines and Cambridge-based Black Rose Anarcho-Feminists did, they split into multiple study and action groups. There's a similar principle in the Pirate Party's sort of founding document, Swarmwise. Take a look at that. These groups also acted as affinity groups that collectively participated in action around various local and national issues, from the local food co-op to international political prisoner support to the lesbian movement to ecology struggles and the anti-nuclear movement. The collective Tiamat, organized in Ithaca, New York in 1975 and originated in Ithaca, New York in 1975 and dissolved in 1978. Their name originated from the tale of a goddess of chaos and creation, feared by men but worshipped by women. I believe Tiamat's like a dragon. The collective read anarchist theory together, shared ideas, and put out an issue of the newsletter Anarcha-Feminist Notes in 1977. According to former member Elaine Leader's reflections, the collective members participated in political activities ranging from protesting the building of a local shopping mall to raising money for a daycare center for political dissidents in Chile. Furthermore, Leader argued that the collective was a functioning quote-unquote anarchistic society. Quote, "We are leaderless, non-hierarchical, and always ready to change." A lot of people aren't ready to change. "We live self-management, learn what it is together, and support each other." Tiamat, unquote. Tiamat supported Leader's interest in the mental health liberation movement and her successful effort to stop the introduction of electroshock therapy at a local mental hospital. This is still an issue today with the struggle of myself and other non-ableist feminists to stop the ABA industry, which electroshocks autistic children. That is an issue that I had with, let's say, some of the fundraising contingents that were giving money to the NDP and still are. The NDP's own committee voted that it's child abuse, and then that was suppressed in a cover-up. So you can read about that on my blog. So not much has changed there either. We have to oppose electroshock therapy and worry about what we're going to do about TERFs. Anarcha-feminists worked in a wide variety of movements and thus brought their prefigurative and feminist ideals to a diverse audience. Furthermore, a focus on education allowed anarcha-feminists to develop their own autonomy and talents. However, these diverse activities and the ephemeral nature of these collectives illustrate why anarcha-feminism is almost always ignored by historians, and documents or records of these collectives are difficult to find. To unite a small, decentralized movement, anarcha-feminists created communications networks through newsletters and conferences. At the Yellow Springs Socialist Feminist Conference in Ohio in 1975, the future members of Tiamat met, and anarcha-feminists proposed that they should combine their networks and mailing lists. After the conference, anarcha-feminists established new collectives in Bloomington, Illinois, and Buffalo, New York. The conference was considered notable for its lack of a definitive definition of socialist feminism, and its broad, quote-unquote, principles of unity included 2 items associated with radical feminism and anarcha-feminism, but condemned by male socialists. Recognizing the need for an autonomous women's movement and that all oppression is interrelated, its broad principles illustrated how socialist feminists viewed economic oppression as one of many forms of domination rather than as the quote-unquote linchpin, as male Marxists tended to argue. Economic oppression. Similar in format to Siren, Anarcha-Feminist Notes originated from a merger of 2 short-lived newsletters, Anarcho-Feminist Network Notes and the Anarchist Feminist Communications Network. A different collective published each issue of the newsletter, and thus each varied in style and content. The Des Moines Anarcha-Feminist Study and Action Group, Tiamat, and the Utopian Feminists were among the collectives who published issues of the newsletter. Although the last issue was published in March 1978, Anarcha-Feminist Notes, while it existed, acted as an effective means of communication for a decentralized movement. Prior to Tiamat's dissolution, it sponsored an anarcha-feminist conference in June 1978 that attracted women from London, Italy, Toronto, and several U.S. cities. In an idyllic location in Ithaca, women attended 3 days of workshops on topics such as anarcha-feminism and unions, self-liberation as social change, the ecology movement, and anarcha-feminism. The ecology movement and anarcha-feminism, women in violence, building the anarcha-feminist networks, matriarchy and feminist spirituality, beards and body hair, combating racism, and anarcha-feminism and class. The conference's theme was, quote, anarcha-feminism growing stronger, unquote, which referenced the growth of anarcha-feminist theory and action since its inception. A packet given to conference attendees contained an essay called Tribes by Martha Courteau, which echoed conference-goers' feelings about building anarcha-feminist community. Quote, we tell you this, we are doing the impossible. We are teaching ourselves to be human. When we are finished, the strands which connect us will be unbreakable. Already, we are stronger than we have ever been, unquote. Unlike purely cultural feminism, anarcha-feminists connected this strength and community to a larger fight against domination. Both their personal lives and ongoing efforts in mixed movements like the ecology movement were important parts of their politics. From consciousness raising to counter-institutions. Historian Barbara Ryan argues that the quote-unquote small group sector of the feminist movement virtually disappeared by the mid-70s due to ideological and practical conflicts within the movement and the influence of liberal feminists who advocated larger, structured organizations. However, this frequent narrative, which emphasizes the fast rise and fall of small CR groups, negates the crucial contributions of anarcha-feminists who continued to organize within small, decentralized, and leaderless feminist collectives throughout the 1970s. Radical feminists extended the CR group's anarchistic structure to a variety of other projects, such as domestic violence shelters, living collectives, and periodicals, many of which continued to support women through the late 1970s and into the 1980s. According to Helen Ellen Bogan's 1977 review of anarcha-feminist groups, many of these collectives were not explicitly anarchist, but quote-unquote intuitively anarchist, such as the grassroots domestic violence shelters in Cambridge and LA, where anarcha-feminists worked and observed practices like discouraging women from calling the police to deal with abusive males. Well, I just saw a video of that go kind of wrong at Burning Man, and the female cop had to argue with the anarcha-feminist and the more of an anarchist feminist in Burning Man about whether they were actually going to deal with a reported assault. And they ended up kind of downplaying it, and I'm going to be honest, when it comes to sexual assault, I'm with the cops, not with the people who don't want to call anybody. Ellen Bogan remarks on how anarcha-feminists joined in women's health clinics in Los Angeles, Seattle, and Boston, which resisted cooperation with the state and utilized collective process. In a 1972 article in Siren, LA anarcha-feminist Evan Paxton explained the anarcha-feminist principles of these self-help clinics, including the one where she worked. Clinics gave, quote, women the confidence and knowledge to take care of their own bodies, which is essential in the struggle for self-control, unquote. Women's health clinics help women avoid the paternalism of usually male doctors and gain self-control. Anarcha-feminists operated a free school in Baltimore which taught courses on Wilhelm Reich, he's not very feminist, is he? Movement structural skills, how to form a co-op, and anarchist and feminist political theory. Others worked on media projects like feminist newspapers or journals such as Through the Looking Glass, which focused on women prisoners, the Second Wave, and feminist radio stations. We did one of those. This focus on outreach and education illustrates anarcha-feminists' long-term approach to revolution. Theorists like Kornegger and Rebecca Staten argued that anarchist revolution, both historically and in the present, requires preparation through education, the creation of alternative non-hierarchical structures, changes in consciousness, and direct action. As Staten wrote in a 1975 article in Anarcho-Feminist Network Notes, anarchists have seen their role in the revolutionary process as agitators and educators, not as vanguard. The revolution for anarchists is the transformation of society by people taking direct control of their own lives. In 1976, in the first issue of Anarcha-Feminist Notes, Judy Stein, an anarcha-feminist who worked at a feminist health center, described her experiences with collective processes, self-help, and feminism there as, quote, ways to live out anarchism, unquote. By working at self-help clinics, free schools, feminist radio stations, newspapers, and domestic violence shelters, anarcha-feminists spread their ideas and organizational methods and help themselves and other women in their own struggles for autonomy. The self-described gay anarcho-feminist printer, Come Unity Press, explicitly connected their political philosophy to their organizational structure. Founded in 1972, the press published Anarchism, the Feminist Connection, feminist writings of Emma Goldman, and an issue of Anarcho-Feminist Notes, and other classic anarchist writings like the speeches of Sacco and Vanzetti. Notably, they allowed members to decide for themselves how much they could afford to pay for the use of their printing facilities, which exemplified their anarcha-feminist philosophy of survival by sharing. The women of the press wrote in 1976, quote, "As anarcho-feminists, we want to end all forms of domination. Money is a tool of power. It is a means of enforcing racism, sexism, or starvation and control over basic survival." Unquote. In a 1976 article critiquing, quote, "feminist businesses," unquote, in the second wave, Peggy Kornegger praised this model and wrote that the press's, quote, "survival by sharing certainly demonstrates, if nothing else, that there are ways of confronting capitalism that don't involve either power or control and that work," unquote. This alternative model helped the feminist movement and its own members survive. Quote-unquote anarcho-sexism and anarcho-feminist interaction with the anti-capitalist left. Anarcho-feminists also worked within the larger anarchist movement, attending anarchist conferences and confronting sexism in mixed groups. Anarcho-feminists attended the Anarchs of New York sponsored Live and Let Live festival in April 1974. Anarcho-feminist groups like the New York Anarcho-Feminists and Community Press participated along with several hundred other conference goers, and the final schedule included 4 anarcho-feminist workshops amongst many other unscheduled lesbian and anarcho-feminist discussions and meetups. The feminist periodical Off Our Backs included a report on the conference written by 2 anarcho-feminists, Mecca Reliance and Jean Horan. Reliance, who attended both mixed and impromptu women-only workshops on anarcho-feminism, wrote that the mixed workshop was uninteresting and focused on the abolition of the nuclear family, apparently the only comfortable topic for the many male attendees. Oh God. While the women-only workshop was energetic and facilitated a focus on organization and internal process. This mirrored one impetus towards separatism in the radical feminist movement. Male-dominated meetings in the New Left led women to censor their thoughts and long for an environment where they could speak freely and determine their own agenda. Anarcho-feminists also attended the 1975 Midwest Anarchist Conference and experienced several incidents of sexism, such as a man trying to take a hammer away from Karen Johnson, assuming that she could not use it because of her gender. Oh dear. However, the man eventually accepted her and other women's criticism of his actions. Dear me. Anarcho-feminists experienced sexism in the Industrial Workers of the World, IWW meetings, and conflicts over sexism in anarchist periodicals like the Social Revolutionary Anarchist Federation Bulletin and The Match confirmed that many male anarchists shared the sexist attitudes of their Marxist counterparts. These attitudes encouraged separatism, but some anarcho-feminists worked in mixed collectives. Grant Purdy, a member of the Des Moines Anarchist Feminists, the New World Collective, which existed from 1973 to 76, wrote an article about her group's experience in a mixed anarchist group called the Red Wing Workers Organization in the spring 1977 issue of Anarcho-Feminist Notes. RWO focused on healthcare organizing, but the women in the group pushed feminist perspectives and led the group to treat personal struggles as political ones. She argued that despite frustrations, women could thrive in mixed groups if they created separate women's groups outside of the larger organization, as the Des Moines women did. Women in mixed anarchist organizations taught male anarchists about their own misogyny and learned new skills from their comrades. Moreover, for anarcho-feminists like Purdy, quote, "involvement with men has always been conditional. Men are clear that they are not a priority for us over other women," unquote. These separate women's support groups and their presence at conferences illustrate how anarcho-feminists brought their ideas and organizational styles to the male anarchist movement as the radical feminist movement declined. Differing feminisms. From the beginning of the movement, anarcho-feminists differentiated socialist feminists and their theories from the traditional male socialist left. In a 1971 article in the first issue of Siren, Arlene Wilson's Chicago-based anarcho-feminist group emphasized that anarcho-feminists, quote, "are all socialists," unquote, and, quote, "refuse to give up this pre-Marxist term," unquote, and continued, "We love our Marxist sisters and have no interest in disassociating ourselves from their constructive struggles," unquote. In 1974, Black Rose anarcha-feminist Marian Leighton commented that socialist feminist literature is not narrowly dogmatic or opportunistic like that of traditional male Marxists. I'm just going to plug in my power here. Like that of traditional male Marxists. You know the type. Rather, it could be included in anarcha-feminist analysis. Anarcha-feminist filmmaker Lizzie Borden argued in a 1977 article in feminist art journal Heresies that Marxist women like Rosa Luxemburg, Alexandra Kollontai, and Angelika Balbanoff came closer to anarchism in their opposition to bureaucracy, authoritarianism, and the subversion of the revolution by the Bolsheviks than their male comrades. However, like Leighton, she emphasized that these anarchistic tendencies stemmed from socialization and lack of access to power, not simple essentialist understandings of gender. As Carol Ehrlich wrote in her 1977 article, Socialism, Anarchism, and Feminism, which appealed to socialist and radical feminists to embrace anarchism, quote, "Women of all classes, races, and life circumstances have been on the receiving end of domination too long to want to exchange one set of masters for another," unquote. Leighton, Kronegger, and Ehrlich argued the defining distinction between radical feminism and anarcha-feminism was largely a step in self-conscious theoretical development. Thus, it was feminists' unfamiliarity with anarchism that led them to embrace Marxism. Although their ideology, quote, skeptical of any social theory that comes with a built-in set of leaders and followers, unquote, held more in common with anarchism. So this is where feminism went wrong, guys. It became Marxist instead of anarchist. Oh dear. Anarcha-feminists and socialist feminists often found their common interests outweighed their ideological differences and worked together. Arlene Wilson was also a member of the socialist feminist group, the Chicago Women's Liberation Union, CWLU, along with other anti-authoritarian women. Wilson introduced Penny Pixler and other CWLU women to the Chicago chapter of the newly reconstituted IWW in the early 70s. They found the Chicago IWW less patriarchal and hierarchical than many Marxist parties and sects that were impressed with its history of women organizers. Several joined the union and became active in the Chicago branch in addition to their continued work with CWLU projects. The CWLU dissolved acrimoniously in 1976 due to internal conflict over what some members observed as the group's white middle-class orientation. Oh, that could never happen. Pixler and other former members shifted their primary activity to the IWW. Pixler contributed many articles to the Industrial Worker, focusing on women workers and contributing an article about the position of women in Maoist China to anarcha-feminist literary journal Whirlwind in 1978. Anarcha-feminists were also influenced by the theories of the French situationalists who positioned women's oppression as a part of larger systems of power relations without reducing it to an effect of capitalism. Carol Ehrlich and Lynn Farrow argued that situationism should be a component of anarcha-feminist analysis because it emphasizes both an awareness of capitalist oppression and the need to transform everyday life. Situationists expanded Marx's theories of alienation and commodity fetishism to apply to modern consumer capitalism and argued that capitalist society led to the increasing tendency towards the consumption of social relations and identity through commodities and alienated people from all aspects of their lives, not just their labor. In her 1977 article, Socialism, Anarchism, and Feminism, Ehrlich argued that a situationist analysis is applicable to anarcha-feminist theory. With a situationist analysis, all women's oppression is real, despite their class status. Yes, multidimensional. Furthermore, women held a special relationship to the commodity economy as both consumers and objects to be consumed by men. Ehrlich argued, quote, a situationist analysis ties consumption of economic goods to consumption of ideological goods, and then tells us to create situations, guerrilla actions at many levels that will break that pattern of socialized acceptance of the world as it is, unquote. Historian Alice Eccles argued that after 1975, cultural feminism eclipsed radical feminism. Let's read that again. Cultural feminism eclipsed radical feminism. Very interesting. And fundamentally depoliticized it. What a tragedy. I'm not being sarcastic. Sorry, that sounded a little sarcastic. That's a tragedy. She wrote, quote, radical feminism was a political movement dedicated to eliminating the sex class system, whereas cultural feminism was a countercultural movement aimed at reversing the cultural valuation of the male and devaluation of the female. Unquote. Eccles argued that feminists embraced cultural feminism because they could not deal with their differences in race, class, and sexuality, and it became easier to subsume them under universal ideals of womanhood. Anarcho-feminism embraced elements of cultural feminism, but rejected its apolitical aspects, and the popular matriarchy theories pioneered by Elizabeth Gould Davis, Jane Alpert, Phyllis Chesler, and Mary Daly. These essentialist theories argued that the negative valuation of femininity, rather than femininity itself, should be challenged, and that power in the hands of women rather than men could lead to a feminist society. For example, Jane Alpert's influential manifesto, Mother Right, argued that women's potential for motherhood made them different from, but superior to, men. Well, hopefully not in every dimension. Ehrlich critiqued, quote-unquote, spirituality trippers and the Amazon nation for being out of touch with the reality of political and economic oppression and for failing to recognize that all power, whether in the hands of women or men, is coercive. But other anarcho-feminists saw positive aspects of cultural feminism. Kathy Levine, and by the way, Amazon Nation is in capitals. They're not talking about just the Amazon, they mean a publication. Kathy Levine defended cultural projects and argued, quote, creating a woman's culture is the means through which we shall restore our lost humanity, unquote. To Levine and other anarcho-feminists, notably Peggy Cornegger, who crafted a theory of anarcho-feminist spirituality, anarcho-feminists embrace both the cultural and political. As many former feminists embraced spirituality gurus and their pacifying, depoliticizing, and anti-feminist programs, Cornegger argued that feminists must embrace both the feminist spirituality of theorists such as Mary Daly and physical and political resistance. Her 1976 article, The Spirituality Ripoff, in The Second Wave, argued for a feminist approach to spirituality which emphasized both personal growth and political action. Cornegger wrote, quote, we need no longer separate being and action into two categories. It means that we need no longer call ourselves, quote, cultural feminists or, quote, political feminists, but we must see ourselves as both. It means teaching ourselves womancraft and self-defense, unquote. Describing this realization as a revolutionary leap of consciousness, quote unquote, Cornegger positioned anarcho-feminism as the next stage of consciousness raising, which would mend the divides between spirituality and politics and between groups of feminists. Anarcho-feminists combined aspects of radical, cultural, and socialist feminism, but added a critique of domination itself. Unlike socialist feminists, they saw non-hierarchical structures as, quote, essential to feminist practice, unquote. Both radical and anarchist feminists dedicated themselves to building prefigurative institutions, a task socialist feminists do not always see as a vital part of their revolutionary program. While cultural feminists often rejected quote-unquote male theory and their roots in the New Left in favor of a depoliticized approach to feminism, anarcho-feminists combined emphasis on building a women's culture with a strong theoretical perspective and class consciousness. Constantly learning from other feminists and adjusting anarcho-feminist theory accordingly rather than dogmatism was a crucial feature of anarcho-feminism and part of the reason anarcho-feminists participated in such a variety of movements. There's a great lesson in that. Great lesson there. Sue Negrin wrote that, quote, no political umbrella can cover all my needs, unquote, while Cornegger argued that it was crucial to break down barriers between feminists. As she wrote in 1976, quote, although I call myself an anarcho-feminist, this definition can easily include socialism, communism, cultural feminism, lesbian separatism, or any of a dozen other political labels, unquote. Anarcho-feminists learned from women in other parts of the feminist movement despite their disagreements. The tyranny of structuralistness, or the tyranny of tyranny. The movement's debate over structure and leadership gave the new anarcho-feminist position relevance and strategic value. An anarchistic commitment to equality and friendship structured feminist political organizations and fostered egalitarianism and respect and reinforced mutual knowledge and trust. But when groups became clique-like and elites emerged, feminists utilized various structural methods to ensure equality. Radical feminist groups utilized lot systems to distribute tasks in an egalitarian manner, disc systems that ensured equal speaking time by distributing an equal amount of discs to members at the beginning of the meeting and instructing them to give one up each time they spoke, and collective decision making through consensus or other means. I like that disc system because sometimes you think, at the previous meeting I was talking too much, so I'm going to be quiet and earn myself a right to speak. But if you're quiet for the whole meeting and then you try to speak at the end, people are like, well, where did you have to actually speak to get the right to speak in that system. But with these discs, it's like, well, I got a disc right here, you have to listen. They viewed women's capacities as equal, but stymied by their socialization, and empowered thousands of women to write, speak in public, talk to the press, chair a meeting, and make decisions for their first time. However, the goals of empowerment and egalitarianism came into conflict. Quote-unquote elites, or women with informal leadership positions within groups, often socially coerced other women into agreeing with them. I've never seen that before. Or not stating their opinions at all. And in reaction, the movement developed a paranoia about elites. Women who exercised leadership or even attempted to teach skills to other members were often shunned and trashed. Oh dear. This triggered bitter statements like Anselma Del Olio's 1970 speech, quote, divisiveness and self-destruction in the women's movement, a letter of resignation, unquote, which claimed, quote, if you are an achiever, you are immediately labeled a ruthless mercenary, out to get her fame and fortune over the dead bodies of selfless sisters who have buried their abilities and sacrificed their ambitions for the greater glory of feminism, unquote. Ironically, to some women, this justified the behavior of women who were in fact dominating others, and then presented themselves as tragic heroines destroyed by their envious and less talented quote-unquote sisters. In her widely read 1970 article, Jo Freeman, going by the pen name Joreen, argued that not only feminist personal practices, but the, quote, tyranny of structurelessness, unquote, limited democracy, and that to overcome it, groups needed to create explicit structures accountable to their membership. Well, yeah, this kind of echoes what I said at the outset. After circulating widely among feminists, the paper was published in the feminist journal The Second Wave in 1972. To Freeman, structure was inevitable because of individuals' differing talents, predispositions, and backgrounds, but became pernicious when unacknowledged. Leaders were appointed as spokespeople by the media, and structurelessness often disguised informal, unacknowledged, and unaccountable leadership and hierarchies within groups. Thus, Freeman argued that structure would prevent elites from emerging and ensure democratic decision-making, like a voting system. And it matters which one you have, which requires some math. Some anarcho-feminists, such as Carol Ehrlich, agreed with this part of Freeman's analysis, while others, like Kathy Levine and Marian Layton, opposed structure entirely. However, Joreen also decried the small group size and emphasis on consciousness raising as ineffective and advocated for large organizations. Even after calling for, quote, diffuse, flexible, open, and temporary, unquote, leadership, Freeman argued that to successfully fight patriarchy, the movement must move beyond the small groups of its consciousness-raising phase and shift to large, usually hierarchical organizations. Anarcho-feminists asserted that the small group was not simply a reaction to male hierarchical organization, but a solution to the movement's problems with both structure and leadership. In 1974, Kathy Levine, the co-writer of, quote, Blood of the Flower, unquote, wrote the anarcho-feminist response to Freeman, quote, the tyranny of tyranny, unquote. Often printed with Freeman's essay, Levine's piece first appeared in the anarchist journal Black Rose. Levine argued that feminists who utilize the, quote, movement-building, unquote, strategies of the male left forgot the importance of the personal as political, psychological oppression, and prefigurative politics. Instead of building large, alienating, and hierarchical organizations, feminists should continue to utilize small groups which, quote, multiply the strength of each member, unquote, by developing their skills and relationships in a nurturing, non-hierarchical environment. Building on the theories of Wilhelm Reich, she argued that psychological repression kept women from confronting capitalism and patriarchy, and thus caused the problem of elites. Absolutely, psychological repression. Developing small groups and a women's culture would invigorate individual women and prevent burnout, but also create a prefigurative alternative to hierarchical organization. She wrote, quote, "The reason for building a movement on a foundation of collectives is that we want to create a revolutionary culture consistent with our view of the new society. It is more than a reaction. The small group is a solution." Unquote. Similarly, Carol Ehrlich, Sue Negrin, and Lynn Farrell argued that the small group allowed individuals to fight oppression in their everyday lives. All oppression involved individual actors, even if they acted as an agent of the state or the ruling class. Absolutely, so important. Sue Negrin, a member of Murray Bookchin's Anarchos group and radical feminist, wrote and published Begin at Start in 1972. Negrin argued that the root structures of domination lie in everyday life because we are dominated, but also dominate others, especially in sexual relationships and parenting, and applied this theory to her own life and relationships with her husband and children. These ideas reflected the feminist emphasis on the personal as political and pointing out domination in everyday life. Mutual trust in small groups helps people recognize and work with stylistic differences rather than trying to eliminate them. Similarly, Sue Katz, an anarchist lesbian leader of the working class feminist Stick It in the Wall Motherfucker collective, responded to Rita Mae Brown's calls for a lesbian party in a May 1972 issue of The Furies, not the Furries, claiming that small groups were actually efficient and could deal more effectively with internal problems. There's a bit of a multi-dimensional comparison going on there. The small group emphasized the personal as political and developing relationships instead of the national campaign-related strategy of liberal feminists and some socialist feminist groups, although you do want to focus on Election Day when it's Election Day. Levine's individualist focus starkly challenges the emphasis on conformity to ensure egalitarianism in many groups. An anarcho-feminist understanding of equality, rather, would allow women to excel in different areas provided they teach others the skills. Yeah, not this like, oh, I'm more skilled, and that's why the other women hate me. Like, well, are you teaching any of the skills that you claim to have? Indeed, much anarcho-feminist work was educational, and theorists like Kornegger focused on political education as a crucial area of tactics. As she argued in Anarchism, the Feminist Connection, women's intuitive anarchism and egalitarianism was counteracted by socialization in an authoritarian society, but anarchist history and theory provided useful precedent for creating egalitarian structured organizations that also ensured leadership development and individual autonomy. Kornegger cited the example of the achievements of the anarchist organization CNTFAI, what does that stand for, and the collectives during the Spanish Civil War as an example of, quote, the realization of basic human needs, freedom, individual creativity, and collective cooperation, unquote. Historically, anarchists grappled with the same questions of structure, organization, and prefiguration feminists were debating. These examples of political education and fluid structures that rotated tasks and leadership would help feminists watch for elites without resorting to voting or hierarchical models of organization. I'm not sure about resorting to voting. There's nothing that bad about voting, is there? I'm not really sure what they meant there. But we'll talk a lot about voting at some point. I've written a lot about it. No gods, no masters, no nukes. As the anti-nuclear movement emerged and gained strength through the Seabrook nuclear power plant occupation and later the 1979 Three Mile Island nuclear meltdown incident, anarcho-feminists shifted their activity to large mixed-gender coalitions of affinity groups. Many anarcho-feminists who attended the 1978 Anarcho-Feminism Growing Stronger conference sponsored by Tiamat met up at the Seabrook anti-nuclear demonstrations, which attracted thousands to participate in non-violent civil disobedience to occupy the plant. Tellingly, when Tiamat eventually dissolved, members joined a women's anti-nuclear affinity group, the Lesbian Alliance, and others worked with a mixed group on ecology issues. Although they usually participated in women-only affinity groups, they interacted with men in authoritarian male politics in the larger movement. Anarcho-feminists also formed collectives in universities like Hunter College, Cornell, and Wesleyan. Often influenced by the writings of Murray Bookchin, who advocated political study groups, these affinity groups became the primary organizational model of the anti-nuclear direct action movement, just as the similarly structured small group was the organizational model of the radical feminist movement. Through the 1980s, anarchist feminists connected the ideas they formed in the women's liberation movement to an even wider range of issues, including violence against women, environmental destruction, militarism, and the nuclear arms race, something we are quite familiar with recent events in Iran. Roxanne Dunbar-Oritz argues in the introduction to Quiet Rumors that the anarcha-feminist movement, quote, had to all intents and purposes ceased to function, unquote, by 1980, as liberal feminists eclipsed radicals and male anarchists remained traditional in their sexism. Tell me about it. However, even as anarcha-feminists shifted from focusing primarily on women's oppression to a wider array of political issues, the organizational form and process and the concern with both the personal and political remained. Consensus decision-making, a hallmark of prefigurative politics, was referred to as feminist process in the anti-nuclear movement, illustrating the influence of the many anarcha-feminist affinity groups and other feminists. However, it remains to be seen if replacing a separate women's movement of small affinity groups with often mixed-gender affinity groups was strategic. Today, many anarchist women and queer people, often in reaction to the sexism of anarchist men and rape culture inside anarchist collectives and movements, are forming their own affinity groups once again. It is worth investigating how changing ideas about gender and sexuality and the rise of queer and trans politics affected this change, and if it is a strategic one. And once again, how much has changed. This isn't like a super recent article, but it's still very relevant, that part. Women's only spaces. How did theories of intersectionality and black feminism interact with anarcha-feminism and differ from earlier anarcha-feminist arguments that often did not directly address racial politics? The history of anarcha-feminism points to these and many more questions in an area of anarchist politics and theory that is generally under-investigated. Conclusion. Often anarcha-feminists remarked that women were, quote, natural anarchists, unquote, and positioned feminists as an untapped revolutionary force. However, neither the women's movement nor the women in it always acted anarchistically. As activist Kaitha Curran wrote in 1980, quote, if anarchist tendencies within the feminist movement are accepted as a natural byproduct of being female, it puts an unfair pressure on women to, quote, live up to their natural anarchism, unquote, and limits our potential for political development. Many women's groups do disintegrate. Many women do exploit other women and men, unquote. Yeah, tell me about it. Radical feminists functioned as anarchists in anarchist spaces while lacking knowledge of anarchism. I think this proves the power of prefigurative politics and liberated anarchist spaces and organizations free of the unnatural hierarchies that the white supremacist capitalist patriarchy forces upon us to bring out the, quote, intuitive anarchism, unquote, of a variety of people from white middle-class feminists to Occupy Wall Street protesters. And by the way, since Occupy Wall Street, there's been an attempt to divide and conquer based on identity politics. Whether their relationships are based on sisterhood, ecology, or race or class solidarity, people have tried and sometimes failed to live without dominance and hierarchy. Once radical feminism was, as Kornegger wrote, quote, the connection that links anarchism to the future, unquote. We must look for similar links in our own movements today. We can see them throughout what anarchist scholar and activist Chris Dixon termed the anti-authoritarian current, from the prison abolition movement to the radical environmental movement to queer and feminist struggles today. If another world is possible, we can and must create it now. That's by Julia Tanenbaum. Whenever she wrote this, it says Julia Tanenbaum is a library student and Black Rosa Negra member in LA. She works to put anarcha-feminist theory into practice in the anti-capitalist feminist coalition and in the Palestine Solidarity movement. Well, that wasn't touched on here at all. This is very, very relevant today, I guess. So I'm not going to comment. I'm going to let Julia Tanenbaum have the last word today. Have a good day, everyone.